Okay, so in today's video, we're going to talk about escaping your personal playground. What does playground mean in this context? And it basically means the fun you have when making your game. Okay, this is important, and this is going to be a little bit controversial. But let me ask you this before we continue. Do you think that game development can feel endless? And more importantly, do you think making games should be fun? You see, the reason why I'm concluding this is because when you play a video game, it is entertaining because that's the purpose of the video game, right? But because the product as a whole is fun, you could also agree, and it really depends on your circumstance here, but making video games could also be another source of entertainment. I say this because there's no other medium that scratches the need of creation the way that games do. In other words, you have the ability to express yourself artistically. You have a form of where you can play around with audio. You can do a bunch of storytelling. You have the ability to make emulated experiences. You're always solving your own problems. And as you're doing this entire process, you're growing as a person, you're learning, you're getting more technical. And what's very interesting about this is, like I said, there's no other medium that allows you to do this. Funny because like as an author, I used to do storytelling all the time, but I always wanted to get people to grab the characters and like play them around like puppets, right? And I realized, video games is probably the best outlet to do that. But in addition, you just have so many more layers from this. So you combine the fact that video games, making them, fulfills the need of creation, and the entire time it can be very entertaining and fulfilling because you're working on it a lot, right? So if you agree with that premise, right? If you think, okay, making games can be fun and it's really entertaining and it scratches all these needs, would you also say that game development could be a relief? Or in other words, do you think that making games can be a form of escapism? Maybe it's probable that in a modern day, human's life, we have jobs, we have routines, we have these activities that we have to like, we're kind of like forced to engage in, and sometimes they're pretty boring, or they don't necessarily cause most dopamine. It's like, okay, well, this is just part of life. I'm not saying that life is boring, but there's just going to be those moments where you're like, okay, this is a mundane task I must actively engage with because society is asking me to pay the bills, for example, right? And so if you go to game development with the hopes and dreams of launching and doing all these things, that's really good. But if you find yourself in this endless cycle where you're just always making your prototype and you're going back and forth with the mechanics, this and that, and you tell yourself that excuse of like, oh yeah, one day it'll launch, one day I'll finish this and that. Sure, but are you coping? And I say this because, are you viewing game development as a form of relief rather than another job or another like objective that you can progress with your life, right? I ask this because I want you to keep this in mind. Do you think that the excitement of building your game is actually keeping you trapped? And let me explain this. Because when you're creating something without an endpoint, without termination, when you build something for the fun of it, as if it were a hobby or, just again, for entertainment purposes, there's really nothing wrong with that except that it is self-stimulating. Meaning, again, you are satisfying yourself by giving the solutions of your own problems. You are expressing yourself artistically. You are engaged in an activity that forces you to be creative. And these are wonderful things. This is absolutely the reason why I think game development is such a beautiful career to, pursue and everything. The problem is that if you're stuck in this endless cycle over and over and over, you will practically prioritize the ability to have fun with your game versus actually launching your game. And so my argument here is, hey, launching a game actually requires boring work. It requires you to sit down, put your head down, work on these boring systems, make your game messy, do the things that you don't really want to focus on or really do at the end of the day. And it truly depends on what type of game you end up making. But the idea that I'm trying to get here is that sometimes we excuse ourselves by saying, hey, I'm going to make my game, I'm going to polish it, I'm just going to endlessly iterate until it feels good, right? And the keyword is the emotion part of like, oh, this feels good, right? And that is the thing. It does feel good. It is entertaining. It is fulfilling the need of creation. So there's nothing really wrong with this, except that if you are trying to become a commercial indie developer or someone that wants to launch your game consistently, you really need to work on the boring part of development, which nobody wants to hear this, but like there's a part of it where like you have to treat it like a job, right? Where you have to assess your deadlines, you have to put your time limits, you have to have design constraints, you have to have a plan, you have to have all these extra boring things that on paper they might sound exciting, but deep down it's like, okay, that's a lot of work that I have to do, right? And so I call this escaping the playground, because the more you're stuck in the process of just self-satisfying that creation need, the more play you're having, the more entertainment, the more fun you are having when you're making your game. And again, if you're a hobbyist or if this is something that you just genuinely want to do, that's absolutely fine. But for those that have the goal of launching and really want to take that seriously and, kind of like reach levels where you can progress often so that you can continue growing your milestones and, build a career out of this, you are required to escape the playground. And so I'm going to kind of explain like the key trick of how you can do this. But the thing is, the playground is kind of like the reason why I'm using the word playground here is because it comes down to how you feel when you are interacting with what we call your inner child, right? And I don't want to sound cliche when I say this, but an inner child always wants candy. And what that means is, inner child or like children in general, right? They want to have fun. They don't really think in long terms. They kind of avoid stressful situations. They're fundamentally very experimental with how they toy around and like mess around with their environment. And they get frustrated at boredom, right? These are like generalizations. But the idea that I'm trying to stress here is that we all have a inner child inside of us that wants to have fun and wants to have all of these expressions somewhere, right? At the same time, as we grow up and become more mature and, we have to deal with life and responsibilities and all these things, we kind of become more robust and in a weird way, like weak spirited, right? And what I mean by that is that, you just become this robotic developer. And there's a lot of benefits to this because, a developer or like a robotic person at the end of the day, they are very mission orientated in the sense that they will always finish the task that is assigned to them. They will do what they have to do regardless of how they feel, if they're motivated, if they're not motivated, if they feel happy, if they feel sad. Emotions is like completely disregarded. And this is what we call discipline, right? And, as a developer, it's like, hey, if I want my game to launch, then I need to do steps 1, step 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to step 100,000 million. And if I complete those at the highest standard possible, then I'm going to have a launchable game, right? And I kind of censored this last part here because this is like the solution of like what we actually need in order to become a robotic developer that can still like interact with our inner child, right? Which brings me to my next point that, hey, you're stuck in this playground. You kind of want to mature. You kind of want to like do all these things so that you can finish your game, whatever. But ultimately, the interesting thing about the role of a game developer is that it requires both. You see, it's easy to be robotic and say, oh, I'm just going to do steps 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and, make my game that way. But then you kind of like lack your soul. You kind of lack the juice. There's a lot of things that game development requires you to keep in mind. And obviously the first thing is like, hey, you have to build for the player and you have to keep the player base in mind no matter what. Fun could have a lot of objective tasks or like meanings of what you can do to emulate fun, which is basically like emulating human instincts and such. But the best way to understand that deeper is by kind of like tapping into your inner child and just understanding intrinsically, hey, my game is fun. If I treated how I played the game as if I were, younger, with, kind of like I turned off my brain and I'm just trying to like have this like dopamine effect on me and everything, right? Then yeah, it's important to have that in mind, right? But the thing is, you need both. You need to have the insights of having fun, and you need to have the the robustness of actually getting things done at the same time, right? In other words, I like to call this quote, let the artist meet the businessman. And this is very difficult to do because, again, most of us have this passion of like, oh, we have this vision that we really want to show off, that we really want to work on. But then the businessman is like, well, we have constraints, and that's kind of like not fun, right? But once we're able to synthesize that together, then you basically become a game developer that understands the limits of like what you should be experimenting with, and then the limits of what you should be executing on, right? So what I'm saying is sometimes we're trapped when we're stuck on the creative parts only. Again, the art, the polishing, oh, let me try this. Oh, let me iterate. Let me keep this up. Oh, this is fun. Oh, scope creep. Oh, let me add this. Oh, let me see that. Oh, I have a new idea. Oh, I saw this on Twitter, so I want to copy this. Oh, this is great. Like, that's fine. But I'm telling you again, if your goal is to launch your game, and more importantly, have a career where you launch many games, and that each time you launch a game, you keep improving over and over and over again, you need to escape your playground. So how do we actually escape the playground? And in reality, I genuinely believe it's a very simple solution, right? It comes down to like two different things. It's respecting phases, which means that you have to compartmentalize how you're going to do your development, right? And what that looks like is you're going to have phases of your development. I would invite you to say, hey, make what we call a playground phase, right? And what that basically means is you will spend some time of your development literally goofing off. literally treating it like a toy. Literally, you are a child and you are just experimenting with your game, your mechanics, your characters, your tools. You're just having fun. That's all it is, right? Like, this is the part where you say, I'm not a businessman. I'm not, gonna think about the project as a whole. I'm just gonna be the artist, the visionary, the person that just really wants to experiment with everything, brainstorm, and of course, you want to test your ideas and such, right? But this is what we call the playground phase, the have fun, the tap into your inner child part, right? The next thing is then when you say, you know what, I have an idea that I like a lot. I see a lot of potential with it, so I'm going to commit to this. The key word about commitment, and this is extremely important, because when you commit, it means you are basically promising to deliver something no matter what. So when you have the ability to commit, you're basically saying, you know what, this idea, whether it's good or bad, whether it's high quality or low quality, whether it has all the potential in the world or has no potential in the world, I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to go ahead and make an entire game out of it. This is what we call the prototype phase, where you're basically saying three different things. One, I'm going to take my playground and I'm going to exit it. I'm now going to tap into my robotic developer mindset. I'm going to tap into this, like, okay, I got to get this done no matter what, right? So part two is, making deadlines, time limits and such. And part three is understanding that you need your playtesters to validate if your vision is aligned with what you had in mind. In other words, is your game fun enough so other people can play the game and have fun with it as well? Okay. Now, the key thing that I want to introduce here is that we're talking about how, okay, playgrounding is about, being a child and just having fun, and, you're toying around, you're messing with your engine, you're, doing all these things. Prototyping is kind of like the sheer opposite. You are limiting your creativity completely because you are not being creative anymore. In fact, you are now just going from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, which these tasks are going to be predetermined based off of where you believe your game should go. The whole idea of this is, I'm going to put my game in a state where I can say, okay, whether it looks good or bad, it's going to have all the systems that I need. It's going to have all the features that I want. It's going to support the main mechanic that I've been playgrounding with in the first place. And then once I have everything set, then you're allowed to go to the final phase, which is what I call the polish phase. This is the part where you want to make sure that everything you worked for now feels good, but also looks good. And so the argument that I also want to have with, like, the difference between prototype and polish is that prototype is, it's all systems, it's all features, it's all boring at the end of the day, right? But polish is about taking the art that you originally want to put in your game and letting your game's framework flex it for you. In other words, you can have a GIF, a character, a singular animation, and that's fine. But you would probably be way more effective on impressing others in a market way if your art and your characters and your models could, like, do flips and do attacks and grab weapons and fly everywhere and do what you were envisioning back in the playground phase. Okay? That's the whole point of this. And the one thing that I really want to point out is that, again, you really want to break these down into these three parts. The I'm a child, to I'm a super huge robot, to, okay, now let's synthesize both of these at the end so that we can truly prove what a game developer is. That person that has that creative vision while delivering very technical executive work, right? So how do we actually escape the playground phase? And the key here is, again, adding the deadlines, right? But it's not about adding a deadline and calling it a day. No. The thing is, anyone can self-impose a deadline. I can say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to upload this video. But if I don't respect my goal to the point where I don't deliver, then there's no point in doing the deadline. So in other words, I would tell you, if you're going to experiment around and, play around with your engine and make a game, or at least, like, experiment with the idea of, let me iterate 100 billion times before I commit to the idea of, like, writing this game and everything, put a deadline. You need to do this. And, like, let me bring this with another analogy, right? Let's say, chances are, you grew up and you were a child, right? If you had a parent that was very disciplined and such, they would tell you, hey, we're going to go to the playground, we're going to have fun, whatever. And then they would drop you off there and you'd play there for, maybe 5 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, depending on, like, how your childhood was, right? If your parent says, hey, it's been an hour, we got to go home, and you respect that, then guess what? You recognize that in the entire time that you were playing in the actual physical playground as a child, you knew that you had a limited amount of time, so you had as much fun as possible. But more importantly, you started to understand resource management, meaning you knew you had so many minutes to go down the slide X amount of times, right? And so you would have fun with that. But let's also say that, it's been an hour and your parent is like, hey, we got to go back home, this and that. And then you threw a tantrum and you're like, oh, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to keep playing around, this and that. You started disrespecting your parents as a whole. What happens is that you become, again, like spoiled and disrespectful to the point where you become careless. You grow bad habits and you basically start disrespecting the importance of time and why we have to go back home in the first place, right? And this is a direct analogy for video game development in the three phases we're talking about, because I personally recommend that you should spend 5 to 10% of your entire development cycle just playing around, meaning iterating, testing ideas, just brainstorming, doing everything, and obviously like putting it in the engine and like checking it out. But that 5 to 10% is your most fundamental part, because once you have something that you're very comfortable with, then committing becomes easier. And then once you commit to the actual prototype where you make everything, then guess what? Polishing becomes 10 times easier, because now you have the whole system that works. You now know where your vision came from. And now polishing is just about focusing on making sure that your game feels and plays like you were originally intending in the experimental phase that we call the playground phase, right? All of this is to say that you need to learn how to build things quickly. And more importantly, you have to learn how to build things more effectively, to the point where even if it is a good or bad idea, you take it and you go for it. And I'm going to explain why this is such an important thing in just a second here. But the main takeaway from all this is you need to practice respecting deadlines and time constraints so that you can escape the endless development cycle whenever you're making a game and you just keep iterating and you don't know when to stop. You need to add deadlines, you need to add time constraints, and you need to respect it. That is the key. That is the number one thing that you have to do. If there's anything in this video that you can remember this slide right here. Practice respecting deadlines and time constraints to escape the endless development cycle. If you don't establish these things and if you don't respect these things, you're just going to be stuck at the playground 24/7. All right. Now, don't mistake with what I'm saying. I am not saying dismiss having fun. Okay. I do truly believe that game development requires a level of wonder, right? And wonder basically means it's the vision that you have of like, oh, this is an amazing feeling. This is fun. This is motivating. These are, there's those soft emotional words where it's like, hey, my game allows me to feel like I can, again, input my will into this project and, build something out of it, right? Whether it's a fictional world, whether it's these cool characters, whether it's these action scenes, there's a bunch of things you can do. So having that wonder is fundamental and is important, because that is kind of like part of what juices up the creativity part of like how you're making your ideas and such. But that is to say, like, it's important to have this, but it's more important not to dismiss this either, right? And so the other thing is, making games should be an enjoyable process. But I'm going to say this with a caveat and say it should be enjoyable retrospectively. Meaning the first time you're building something, the first time you see characters move and the start of the project, that's the most exciting part of the development phase. When you reach about, and I would argue maybe like 25% and onwards, everything becomes a sluggish battle of like fighting the bugs, trying to get things to work, trying to make things look good, trying to make things function. Oh, my code isn't working. Oh, I'm actually bored of my own game. Oh, I'm doing this over and over again. Oh, I just spent 12 hours programming the same thing over. Like, it's going to happen. You're going to reach a point where it feels like a job. But that's also part of like the sacrifice of making a game. You need to recognize that there's just going to be those things that you have to do that, whether you like it or not, are required for you to get it at a launchable state. When you launch the game and then look back, you're going to say, wow, I'm so proud I did that. And that feeling is probably something that can override all of the hardships that you went through. But regardless, you need to participate in the ability to make games without really like depending on the motivation or the emotional parts of it. And so the other thing that I'm trying to say as well is you need to practice launching your game. And this is like a very important part, right? Because when you launch your game, you learn how to deal with the market. You learn how to get better at making games. You get feedback that, asks if your game was actually good or not. You start to improve your production process, and then you gain experience to share and use and scale with your next games, right? And so say what you want. And it's funny because you might say, oh, but I can just research, how to launch a game and just do it once and become a successful developer. Hold on. I say this truly at the bottom of my heart, because you not the other person on YouTube, not someone that you're watching, you as a developer, I'm talking to you have to launch your game. Why? Because only you will understand the skill set that you need in order to consistently start launching your games. Okay, meaning, let's say your design was based off of a market trend, right? Like maybe you want to make a horror game, maybe you want to make a multiplayer game, and you're like, oh, I think my design would work because it does XYZ. put it in the market, see what works, get the feedback, get the results, does your design correlate to what the market is demanding? And if so, good. If not, what can you do to improve? That intimate part of only you getting that skill set and that information because you made a game that you launched, and you can go ahead and take that information and put in your next game, is priceless. You can watch all these case studies. You can watch all these developers launch their own games and learn their lessons, and there's value in that. But only you the developer, I know this is a camera that I'm talking to, but you are the one that gets to learn directly what works and what doesn't work. And you can only do this by launching. But again, you can't launch if you're just constantly making your game over and over and over. You need to get it to the point where you pause the playground part and start committing to the fact that you're going to launch your game. Here's another thing, right? Let's say you're making mechanics, and maybe there's a cool mechanic that you add in your game that everyone loved, and now you're like, oh, well, I remember when I was making this mechanic, it worked because I applied these lessons. Boom, that's going to be good. Oh, now you get feedback, not general feedback of game dev, general feedback, specific feedback about the game you specifically created. And then, oh, I spent 90 days making my game. I realized I could have done it in 75 days because only you knew that you made these mistakes. And so everything that I'm trying to tell you is that all of your experiences, all of your skill sets, everything that you're doing to launch your game is an intimate skill that only you will be able to identify. But you cannot reach this level if you don't launch your game. So here's another classic argument. Oh, but I don't want to launch Slop. The market already has a bunch of sloppy games, and I don't want to be part of that development cycle. Okay, fine, fair. But I'm letting you know that I launched my first game in 90 days. I missed a bunch of features, and I realized this game is pretty cheeks. It's bad. It's wow. And so what I decided to do is, could I take this entire game and put it into like a mini game? So I made my game again in this mini game format, and it got better. I added designs that made sense. I took the feedback that was very critical, and I realized, okay, if I can improve these areas, I can make a better game. And then after I did the mini game, I said, you know what? Why don't I just remake the entire game again from scratch, do it again in 90 days, but with all the lessons that I've learned, all the game feel effects, all the polish, recycle all these systems, but also do new things from scratch, focus on the things that actually matter, and boom, another 90 days pass by and I have another game out. Technically, I made Dodge King multiple times, and I'm going to tell you right now, right? The first time was terrible, the second time was even worse, and the third time, I had a little bit more fun retrospectively, right? But the idea that I'm trying to get here is that there's no way I'm going to make a good game if I don't make games. And more importantly, there's no way I can launch a game if I don't launch the game, right? So how do I know what a good launch looks like? How do I know what a bad launch looks like? Well, I have to get in the habit of launching games. How do you do that? Make your game. But more importantly, exit the playground. Exit the endlessness. Put a point where you say, I'm going to make a game. This is my time limit. This is my deadline. This is going to be the pressure point that I put on myself so that I can get this done. And then you might say, okay, cool. You launch Slop. What are you going to do next? Well, guess what? You can always launch your next game. Meaning you get your Slop, your first game is always going to be sloppy, right? Your second game is going to be less sloppy. The third one is going to be even less sloppy. As you continue to launch over and over and over and over again, it just gets cleaner. It gets better. It gets stronger. You become a better developer naturally because you're gaining the skills and the experience. All of this stems from the important lessons you intimately learn from launching. Oh, I want to take my time. Okay. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm just saying that if you have the ability to set deadlines, you will go much farther with the quantity and quality of work that you're able to give by setting these deadlines. This is called Parkinson's law because you're basically saying, okay, I have to do this no matter what. And if I respect it to the point where I get it done, then guess what? I'm going to have results. You collect the information that you get from the results, take that, do it in your next one. Get more information, take that, boom. To make content, you need to make more content. That's all it is. How do I know if a video is going to work or not? I needed to try. My first video was slop. Second video, sloppier. Third video, maybe this one format works. And then it's content takes content. You need to make more content, you need to make content, okay? So I made Dodge King 3 different times. I wrote the same book 2 different times. Then I made a webcomic version of it. Then I started making YouTube videos. Like, I'm using myself as an example here, but the idea is you need to just keep going and going and going and going and going no matter what. The other thing is, again, you will build any skill when you're able to use it in repetition. Like every skill that you build is about reps, right? So Like, you want to get stronger at the gym, you have to do more reps. You want to build your cardio, you have to like start somewhere, right? You want to build a game, start a game. You want to make a portfolio, you have to make multiple games, etc. Okay. Oh, but like, I like toying around, I like messing around. I just think it's boring if I like make the boring parts of the game. Okay, fair. But guess what? There's a lot of other things in life that can be boring. Let's talk about working. Let's talk about commuting. What about those social obligations, right? What about taking care of your health and fitness? What about responding to emails? What about paying the bills? Like, there's some boring things out there that's like, I don't want to do that, but you just have to, right? You just kind of have to sit down and do it. These are subjective points. But like, the whole point I'm trying to say is like, yeah, it sucks, but we got to get through it no matter what, right? Oh, this is strictly my hobby. I don't even want to talk about launching. I just want to be in my playground all day and just build for fun. Cool. Okay, now, do I have to do this? And the thing is, no, you don't. You have the choice to do whatever you want. But the reason why the reason why I want to bring the attention of why you need to establish deadlines no matter what, so that you can launch more frequently, is because I've been seeing results in my game development career where I'm able to launch games rapidly and then learn those lessons and become a better developer over time. But I've also been sharing these lessons with my community here. And so I just want to quickly shout out these developers who have been allowing me to kind of like have consultation calls and collaborate with them to see where they are stuck at with their development and how they can continue making their games more efficiently, and more importantly, getting outside of that playground phase, right? And so these developers here are doing, these games are currently in progress, with the exception of Yotam Frid's Infiniroom, which is already out on. It came out a while ago. The whole point that I'm trying to say here is like, hey, you will be able to make more progress when you realize that I need to do the boarding part. I need to do the part that feels like a job, whether I like it, whether I don't, whether I feel a specific emotion for it, whether it's one of those things where it's like, it's rough, right? And so it's very tempting as a child when you're playing with the toy, you love it, you're having so much fun, and then your parents come in and they're like, hey, you got to leave the playground, we got to go home. Or, oh, playtime's over, you got to go take a shower, then go to bed, whatever. Attaching yourself to that instance of like, I just want to have relief, I want to fulfill that creative need, I want to have fun, I want to be entertained. That's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. All I'm saying is that by limiting and putting those deadlines so that you transition from that phase into the more serious and boring parts will allow you to just continue to progress your career in game development as a whole. So I guess the conclusion I'm trying to say is, hey, you can quote unquote grow up by following deadlines, and you can see how far it gets you. If it works for you, amazing. I've been seeing results. I've been helping others to get these results. If for some reason you disagree or you just completely think I'm wrong and everything, that's absolutely fine. You are your own director at the end of the game, at the end of the day. End game. That's true. There's that. So anyway, I just really hope that this video helps. And just really start practicing making those deadlines. You will cut your development cycle in insane amounts. And even if you don't reach the deadline's end, the amount of progress you'll have by establishing a deadline is insane. Okay. Lastly, all I'm going to say is games are fun. Making games is also fun. Like, opinion, right? But like, all of this can be fun and everything. It's just, you need to learn how to draw the line to sit down and say, you know what? Now's the time to do the boring part, and I will be okay with that, because at the end, I will look back and then I can reward myself by playing a game. Last comment I'm going to say, which is important. You can have the most boring process to make the game, but the thing is, when the game is done and polished and fun and ready, no one's stopping you from booting it up and playing it. And technically, if you do that, you have a reward for playing and having fun again. I've been playing Dodge King forever, basically. I talk about this all the time, where it's like, hey, I spent 90 days making it. I have a bunch of controversial opinions on it, but every now and then I'll just boot it up and play it. And that's a feeling where I'm like, hey, if I didn't do that hard work, I wouldn't have this method to relax. Like, I now can just like come back from work, boot it up, and just stress myself by trying to dodge every single bullet possible. And that's what happens when you're able to launch a game. You get the ability to play a game.